The Harrisburg Manufacturing Company had a very strong relationship with the Naval War College, and that connection continues today. Tom Kalora, who is a board member here at the museum, serves as a dean at the college, and we've developed a really great relationship with the Naval War College Museum through its curator, Rob Doan, who's lectured here in the past. This museum is amazing. It's one of my absolute all-time, the Naval War College Museum. It's one of my all-time favorites, and it includes several items that are directly related to the Harrisburg Manufacturing Company and the museum. I think there are models of stiletto and Cushing, and one of the very few existing Howell torpedoes. Is that correct?
Correct.
Out of how many? There's only like 3 or 4 in the
Right.
existing, right?
This one is complete.
Yeah.
Which makes it totally unique.
Yeah, it's incredible. If you have not been to this museum, you must go. It's not the simplest museum to get to because you need to get clearance before you can go, and it's a process. You can't just go in the afternoon and go there, right? I mean, we'll explain. Yeah, but I highly recommend that you visit. Tonight's guest is the director of the the Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research. Sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful. And is Dr. David Kohnen, otherwise known as Navy Davy. He has had a naval career that has spanned many different places and many different ships, and was interspersed with postings to deserts and things like that, where there's a lot of naval activity going on. He holds a doctorate in naval history at from the University of London. And he's the author of 2 books on key naval leaders and their influence on sea power, I guess I would say. And I think he's got several others in progress. He's taking the publisher perish mantra very, very literally. We really need to thank our good friend and board member, Tom Kalora, for making the introduction to David, and we're thrilled to have him with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Kohnen.
So before we start, first thing I have to tell you, I am a naval historian. I am not a Kennedy family historian. I am not a biographer of John F. Kennedy. But as a naval historian, I trip over sort of interesting sub-facets of my research. And one of them is the story I'll be telling you tonight. So some of you in the room may be familiar with it if you have read some of the biographies of John F. Kennedy. But we all know who this gentleman is on the right side. He created quite a bit of havoc in the 1920s and 30s in Europe, Adolf Hitler. And this woman is identified as Inga Arvid, who was actually German descent, but she lived up in Denmark. And during the 1936 Olympics, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, said that we need to make sure that Hitler is seen with a relatively Aryan, good-looking woman. And so Inga Arvid was that woman. The problem here is that roughly 1937, through Kennedy, Kathleen Kennedy, her brother John got to know Inga Arvid. And we can see, this photograph actually is from the Kennedy Library, and that is identified as Inga Arvid. So, kind of some interesting connections here, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight. I tripped over this story when I was looking at the Anglo-American relationship in intelligence. So you'll see some of those dimensions appear as a sub-theme of this story as well. So again, I am not a Kennedy biographer. However, there's many books written in which this story is told in various forms. Tonight, I will give you some more information that is not available in the biographies that have been recently published about Kennedy's service in the Second World War. I'll talk to you tonight more specifically about the intelligence dimensions, which is a totally different genre of literature, and that's the focus of my primary archival research. So Inga Arvid is kind of an interesting person in the sense that she knew the Kennedys quite well and continued her relationship with John Kennedy into his presidency. She ended up marrying a country and western singer named McCoy. So Inga Arvid's married name ended up being Inga Arvid McCoy, and she had two sons with the McCoys. So she's had an interesting life, and you know, in looking at the biography of Inga Arvid, I found her almost as interesting as I found John F. Kennedy. Okay, so a quasi-war. What is a quasi-war? A quasi-war is a war that's not declared. It's not a situation where I have a clean mandate to go out and engage the enemy more closely like we like to do in the Navy. A quasi-war, such as the one between the US Navy and France during the French Revolutionary Wars, was a historical event that Franklin Roosevelt referred to in 1937 after the troubles begin in Chinese waters. So we were maintaining naval presence in Asiatic and into the Yangtze River Patrol, and a ship called the Panay was sunk in 1937 by Japanese forces that were conducting operations against the Chinese nationalists, ostensibly under the banner of Asia for the Asians and the liberation of Asia from foreign exploitation, which of course happened for centuries and centuries under various European empires. The United States was sort of new to that game. With the Spanish-American War of 1898, we developed a presence in the Philippines, which sort of annoyed the Japanese. And there was an agreement between Taft and Katsura after the Russo-Japanese War. The Taft-Katsura agreement was that the United States recognizes Japan's claim to Korea as long as Japan recognizes the United States claim to the Philippines. Now, most of us in the room probably didn't know any of that, but I promise you, if you ever bump into a Korean, they know all about this history. When Franklin Roosevelt became President of the United States, one of the very first things that he did was he gave us our beer back, which is really important. That's a joke. The second thing that he did, though, is he signed an act called the Philippine Liberation Act. And the Philippine Liberation Act said, we're going to withdraw from the Philippines because we're not an empire. Coincident with that, you had the bonus riots down on the mall, and the Chief of Staff of the Army, a guy named Doug, went down and he beat up on all the veterans of the First World War. So Franklin Roosevelt called Doug down to the White House in 1934, Doug MacArthur, and he said, Doug, you know, good job on suppressing that riot before I became president. Thank you for your resignation. Doug MacArthur, in his memoirs, recalls walking out of the White House, vomiting on the White House steps. Well, the deal was that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get rid of Douglas MacArthur from Washington, D.C. because he really didn't want to deal with his ego and personality. And so what he did is he sent him out to the Philippines with the mission of standing up the Philippine National Army, which is why Douglas MacArthur is in the Philippines. He's there not as an Army general, but as a retired Army general, 2-star rank. And Franklin Roosevelt sweetened the deal by arranging for him to get a special appointment in the Philippine National Army as a field marshal. That's all in 1935. So if you jump ahead 2 years to 1937 with the sinking of the Panay, it's a complicated situation out there in the Pacific area. What's important about the Panay incident is that Franklin Roosevelt looked to that incident and he referred to this as a quasi-war, an undeclared war. He recognized that the conflict in Asia was getting very, very complicated. Now, what does this have to do with the Kennedys? What it has to do with the Kennedys is coincident with the Panay incident. You have the Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiralty, approaching the naval attaché in London, a guy named Alan Goodrich Kirk. Alan Kirk had the mission of collecting intelligence about the British Empire. And when the Panay was sunk in 1937, Kirk sort of reported aboard in 1938, and he's collecting information about the British intelligence system in Asia, but also in Europe. And the issue here is it's a gentleman's relationship, a special relationship. So Admiral Godfrey, who's here on the right, the Director of Naval Intelligence at Admiralty, said, "Alan, why don't you come down to the In-N-Out Club with me and down in Piccadilly? I have some things to tell you." And Alan Kirk started developing this collaborative relationship where they started sharing information, roughly 1938. There's other personalities involved, and among others, it's the Kennedy family who show up. The ambassador to the Court of St. James is Joe Kennedy Sr., and of course we all know about the Kennedy family, the extended family. They came with him to London, and it was sort of a big hit in the media. They were a very glamorous family, and they were billed as being very close friends to Franklin Roosevelt, and of course Franklin Roosevelt, shaking hands with Joe Kennedy here, had his own political reasons for sending Joe Kennedy to the Court of St. James. Joe Kennedy being a Democrat and also very well connected, Roosevelt saw him as a potential political threat too. So just like Doug MacArthur, he said, "Joe, I got a job for you in London. How would you like to go be in London?" And of course, Joe Kennedy agreed to do this prestigious assignment. In reading about Joe Kennedy's arrival, the British newspapers, being the way they are, highlighted the glamorous Kennedy family, but they did make a point to note that Joe Kennedy was wearing slacks when he presented himself to the king. In British sort of tradition, you don't present yourself to the king in slacks. I mean, that's totally American. You're supposed to appear in knickers. So by appearing in slacks, it was sort of a faux pas that made all the London newspapers, and there was a big chuckle about it among the British, and of course us Americans would never get the joke. So it's kind of an interesting development with the Kennedys arriving in Britain right about the time when the empire is starting to feel the pinch of not only the Nazis across the pond or across the channel, but also Imperial Japan out in Asia. Don't forget that the British Empire spanned the globe. The old phrase is that Britannia rules the waves and waves the rules as it suits Britannia. And of course, Winston Churchill, who would become Prime Minister in the Second World War, believed fervently in the concept of British Empire. Joe Kennedy, being a Democrat, being a working man, being Irish, thinks about the empire as sort of a decrepit old idea that doesn't really have standing in the future of the world. So in that respect, he shares the same perspective as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On the other hand, if your job is to develop closer relationships with the British, this may not be a good starting place for that sort of thing. So the sons and daughters of Joe Kennedy are in London having a great time, and they're making connections with people like Winston Churchill and others. Part of the royal family, Kathleen Kennedy, would marry into a title, and of course Jack Kennedy would refer to her as the heiress, within the family. Unfortunately, I'll get into it later, but she was later killed in a plane accident. But it's Kit Kennedy who's the key to this whole story that I'm telling you tonight about Inga Arvid. During her time in London and also traveling over to France and into the Third Reich, she got to know Inga Arvid, who was a journalist, and she ended up introducing John Kennedy to Inga Arvid, and from there the relationship became very, very friendly. The other part of this is that Edward, the former king, ended up getting closer to Hitler as well. So there's a complicated mix of personalities developing roughly 1938 into 1939. And John Kennedy is sort of taking mental notes. He gets to know a lot of people, including Inga Arvid. And he's starting to think about what he wanted to write about for his graduate thesis at Harvard University. And so, among other things that he was doing in Europe in 1937-38 time frame, is he actually goes to Nazi Germany. He actually goes to Berlin and he sees the culture. He's impressed by the efficiency of the Third Reich. He ends up seeing Hitler, and he's deeply impressed with the reaction from the crowd. But he's also seeing the problem with the efficiency of the Third Reich. He's seeing the exclusivity from a cultural perspective of the Nazi regime. And he's making notes about this. And interestingly, as I was doing research, the original transcript of his notes was recently sold off at an auction. So if any of you in the room bought that, I'd like to see it, because I believe it contains some pretty interesting stuff. But Inga Arvid, who's depicted here, ends up getting an AP assignment. This is actually a newspaper article about her, talking about her selection for a very prestigious journalistic assignment. She ends up in Washington, D.C. As an AP reporter. Kennedy, meanwhile, is going throughout the Third Reich, but then he goes down to Rome and he goes to the Vatican and he tries to meet the Pope. I've seen two different accounts. According to one account, he was able to meet the Pope. Another account says he was not. So I don't know whether or not he ever actually had an audience with the Pope. Being an Irish Catholic that he was, I'm sure he really wanted to meet him. But then, more interestingly, he ends up going to Palestine, where the British Mandate is the rule of order in Palestine. Of course, there's an uprising happening. The future folks who are trying to create a state called Israel are already looking to try and create that state in Palestine. Kennedy writes about that. He goes into Egypt and he talks about the British Empire really on its last legs in his observations. And then he comes home and he starts writing it up. And this picture, I really like this picture, by the way, because it shows him, it's obviously staged at his typewriter, an Underwood typewriter. And here's the book that he ends up writing, which was actually his thesis. The book is a play on a title that Winston Churchill conceived, where he's talking about the survey of world affairs from 32 to 38. What Churchill is saying in that book is that the British Empire completely failed to prepare itself for the turmoil that was coming. And Churchill famously gets credit for foreseeing the Second World War. Now, this is where I do have some amount of deeper expertise that I would claim. I would say that the historians who say that Churchill is foreseeing the Second World War are being pretty sympathetic to Winston Churchill. If we were to read that book in the context of 1938, we might be saying, well, he's just a rabble-rouser. He's looking for a war. He's just, going off like Churchill always does. Let's not do Gallipoli again. So the readers in Britain are kind of skeptical of some of the bigger assertions that Churchill makes in this book. So it does create a controversy. John Kennedy is aware of the book, obviously, because when he goes back to Harvard and writes up his thesis, he uses basically the same title. And he talks about the fact that if you don't prepare yourself as a democracy, nations that are not democracies, that have greater efficiency because of its oppressive approach and sort of militaristic view of the world, have the advantage against the democracy if you're not prepared to deal with the potential threat of those other adversaries. And of course, this is the underlying theme of both books. One is written with the King's accent, and the other is written with a Bostonian Irish accent. But the underlying theme is the same. What I would say is don't look back on these books and say, okay, these guys saw it coming. They knew what was going to happen next. The fact is they really didn't know what was going to happen next at the time, but they were predicting based upon what they had observed. And it turns out in the end that they were correct about the threat that the Axis tripartite actually posed to global order. So this section is called Blitzed. 1939, the Athenia is sunk almost immediately after the declaration of war against Nazi Germany by Britain. Now, why is this important? The Athenia is a passenger ship. There are Americans on board. And it's reminiscent of another passenger ship that was sunk during the Great War, the First World War, the RMS Lusitania. And of course, in the newspapers, the British capitalized on the fact that a German submarine did not follow the prize rules and actually sank the Athenia. And on board, the American survivors were brought back to Ireland, and it was Alan Goodrich Kirk, the naval attaché, who brought with him the young son of Ambassador Kennedy to survey the situation and interview the survivors of the Athenia. And Kennedy was writing up the reports of the accounts from the survivors from the Athenia, and those reports were being submitted by Alan Goodrich Kirk to the Office of Naval Intelligence. So even before Kennedy is actually in the Navy, he's doing intelligence work, not only as a journalist, but also because of his close connection with the naval attaché through his father. Now, it's not good times for the British. We all saw the movie Dunkirk, right? It's a long one, but it's well done, I think. You know, there's a lot of movies that talk about the rapid advance of the Nazi armies into France and the quick fall of Europe under the Nazi boot. One thing I would say about that is the German army was a very well run military machine. However, at a tactical level, at an operational planning level, they could plan a good tactical operation. But when you look at German strategy, they never had one. They gambled. They did not actually think through the decisions that they were making. And this is what I like to tell practitioners today. You can develop the perfect plan, and it's probably going to work. But if you don't have a sound strategy with a policy that drives that strategy, you're going to lose the war ultimately. And we can still learn from this history in the contemporary context. Now, I do work for the United States Navy. That is not a statement. It's just a historical fact that history provides perspective on the contemporary issues. And Dunkirk is one of those events that military practitioners should frequently revisit in their planning. Now, of course, the Germans are also using a tactic. It's in their doctrine called Erschrecklichkeit, terror. Creating terror on the interior lines of your enemy is the objective in German doctrine. And so what you see during the Blitz is this escalation. Ultimately, we remember it in the heroic terms of Battle of Britain. But there's a good number of Americans who are in London at the time. Edward R. Murrow, of course, and he's witnessing the families and the British people sort of going through this horrific time period. And of course, when you go to London today, you don't really see it anymore, but the pictures tell 1,000 stories. The old London that we can see in the old movie reels is no longer there. It's really a new city. There's bits and pieces of old London, but the German Luftwaffe did a very good job of renovating the old city of London. And of course, the Kennedy family is wrapped up in all of this history. I always like to show this slide just because I'm a fan. Liverpool being a great maritime city. If you go up to Liverpool, there's the headquarters of the Western Approaches Command, which is what the British, that's the headquarters which routed all the convoys into Britain during the Second World War. But of course, Liverpool is more famous for these guys who were born at the same time. And they played at a club called The Cavern, just around the corner on Matthew Street from the headquarters of the Western Approaches. Right around the corner from there, by the way, if you ever go to Liverpool, don't get wrapped up in the Beatles stuff too much. Right around the corner from there is where John Bullock, Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, ran the Confederate States Navy during the Civil War. So Liverpool is a fun maritime town if you ever go there. Okay, so I hope I'm not boring you yet. What's going on here in 1941 is a quasi-war. So the period from 37 to 41 is a quasi-war. Franklin Roosevelt is talking about quasi-war in a historical sense, quasi-war of 1794, to talk about what he's doing with the Navy in 1939 to 41 timeframe. What he's doing is he's preparing Americans for the prospect of involvement in these global conflicts that are happening separately in Asia and in Germany. The problem is, in 1939, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Axis Tripartite Agreement. Now that makes it seem like the Axis Tripartite was a cohesive coalition that was sort of ganging up on the British Empire and the United States. It really wasn't. So in the newspaper media, when they said Germany and Japan are collaborating for this global conquest, when you actually look at what they did, they didn't collaborate very well. And I'll talk about that in a minute. One last thing before I move on to from this slide. This slide is actually a picture of the Atlantic Conference of August 1941. The people in this slide are really important people. You've got Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill, of course, but this guy over here trying to get into the conversation is a guy named Hap Arnold. He is an Air Force guy, and he's all about air power. I'm not going to get into it, but he created a lot of havoc on the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Second World War because he believed in strategic air power. And what we really needed was tactical air support, which is the point that Ernest King and General Marshall made as the lead members of the Joint Chiefs during the Second World War. What we ended up doing in the Second World War is replicating the British system of command, which is the Joint Staff Organization, and ultimately we created the Combined Chiefs of Staff. This is totally new, and if you do read your Constitution as originally written, we basically adapted our Constitution to conform to this coalition war of the Second World War, and we're still sort of figuring out how that works as a nation. That's another discussion. I hope there's a question for that. Bottom line is George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and in this case, he's the Atlantic Fleet Commander, Ernest J. King, are developing their own sort of thoughts about how Army and Navy can collaborate in the prospective global war that they see coming. Ernest King would become the Chief of Naval Operations after Pearl Harbor, and he had the job of Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. Those are two separate jobs that got merged under him, and my forthcoming book is all about him, so I won't belabor it too much. But he had more authority in the history of the United States Navy than any other naval officer with those two jobs glued together. He essentially ran the global war effort from the maritime perspective. Within that context, you have the Kennedy brothers wanting to do their bit for their nation. Of course, Joe Kennedy Sr. had been sort of removed because of his lack of support for the British. And for about 6 months, there was no ambassador in London. It was being run by a guy named Admiral Gormley. That being said, the Kennedy family still remained very popular among the British. So Kit Kennedy was still in London, and she actually volunteered for Red Cross. Joe Kennedy Jr., who is depicted here with his naval aviator wings, ended up going back to London during the Second World War, and I'll talk about that later. But John Kennedy had to sort of fight to get his commission to get into the U.S. Naval Reserve. We all know about his health problems, and he was found medically unfit. So what's he doing in uniform here? Well, it's very simple. His father had pull, and he was able to help John Kennedy get into the Navy. I just like to show this story as well, just to demonstrate how much Americans were involved with the British war effort before formal U.S. entry into the Second World War. This is Draper Coffman. He is a Naval Academy graduate. He ended up not being able to serve in the Navy, ostensibly due to eye problems, but there's other stories about that. There's something about him dating the superintendent's daughter and getting in trouble. That I think is a sea story, but I can't rule it out either. His father was James Coffman, who became a two-star admiral in the Second World War. But he ended up going into the merchant service, and when the war broke out in 1939, he went to France and served in the ambulance corps in France. He was actually captured by the Germans and released when they determined he was actually an American. He went on a ship, went to South America, and then sailed back to Scotland and joined the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. And the Royal Navy said, great, welcome to Britain. We're going to train you how to defuse bombs because those doggone Nazis are dropping those bombs. And so Draper Coffman learned how to defuse bombs. He gave a speech. This is Trafalgar Square. You can see the distinctive lions. Nelson's like up here. Coffman gives this speech on the 4th of July, 1941, encouraging all Americans to join the British forces to go help them defend the British home islands. After Pearl Harbor, Draper Coffman, this is his father, James, decorating his son with a Navy Cross. Draper Coffman is the guy who brought the UDT, underwater demolition teams, to the U.S. Navy, and he's known as Papa SEAL today because he's the one who created the training program that ultimately today is the SEAL community in the U.S. Navy. So it all starts Second World War. Back to our main character. Of course, we have Kennedy, who's written this great book. He pulls strings through his dad and also through his friend Alan Goodrich Kirk to get into the Navy. So, okay, he's medically unfit. We can't send him to sea duty. What do you do with this guy? He looks great in uniform, so what do we do with him? Well, let's send him back to Kirk. Kirk is now the Director of Naval Intelligence. He's handling ultra sources of intelligence. He's handling magic sources of intelligence. Those are different. So he's got all the special intelligence that you could possibly want. Let's put Kennedy in there with him who can help him out. You know, he's a smart guy too, Harvard graduate, wrote a book, looks good in uniform. So John Kennedy became the aide to the Director of Naval Intelligence, and he's exposed to all this great information about the Axis adversary. Mind you, we are not at war yet. But Kennedy is Kennedy, and you know, Jagger Hoover is kind of interested in Kennedy. He's interested in Joe Kennedy. He's interested in the whole Kennedy family. And it's Jagger Hoover who starts digging up some information about the lifestyle of John F. Kennedy. And he ends up going back to Alan Kirk and saying, Alan, did you know that your aide is actually very closely affiliated with this person named Inga Arvid, who happens to be a Nazi spy? Now, there's no proof, by the way. It's just J. Edgar Hoover is saying that John Kennedy has this very close connection. And did you know that he went to the Third Reich? You know, he knows a lot of people, a lot of Nazis over there. And this guy has full access to all this great special intelligence information through you, Alan Goodrich Kirk. How do you feel about that? So Alan Kirk, being the Director of Naval Intelligence, said, you know, look, this is actually a letter from Inga Arvid. That's Kennedy's hat, by the way. This is from the Kennedy Library. In this paragraph, I'm sure you probably don't see it. But, so I don't know quite what to write to you, Jack dear, because in my heart it will become a love letter. So this is the type of evidence that J. Edgar Hoover is producing. He's intercepting the mail and everything else. So what ends up happening is Alan Goodrich Kirk is suddenly reassigned to sea duty. He's no longer Director of Naval Intelligence. And Jack Kennedy, of course, is sent to South Carolina. To do what? Nope. He has really no job. He is down in South Carolina, and he goes to commissionings of ships, and he lectures at NROTC programs, and he's kind of looking for something to do, and the Navy ends up sending him to Northwestern University to get some good Navy training out there at Northwestern, and Kennedy is just not happy at all. And of course, coincident with all of that is Pearl Harbor, and the war is on. Franklin Roosevelt famously, this month, all those years ago, declared war on Imperial Japan. What's important about that? He did not declare war on Nazi Germany or Fascist Italy. So we're not at war with the Axis tripartite on 8 December 1941. So Hitler did us a favor, as did Mussolini. Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the United States, which is great. So now we are at war with the Axis tripartite. We can actually start talking to our British friends and our French friends and our Dutch and whoever else wants to be our friend. Joe Stalin's our friend. Chiang Kai-shek, Chairman Mao, come on in. We're all friends now. Because Hitler and Mussolini went ahead and declared war on the United States. They cleared the playing field for us. The problem is, this poor guy down here, that's Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz was in charge of all German submarine forces at this time. He was not yet in charge of the German Navy, but he's pretty frustrated because on the 8th of December 1941, in his Kriegstagebuch, his war diary, he says, Pearl Harbor is an event of far-reaching significance. And the reason he says that is because he doesn't have submarines to go attack the United States. He also didn't know that the Japanese were going to attack the United States, which tells you that the Axis tripartite is really three separate powers not really working well together because they all think they're superior to each other. And those are the fissures that we ended up exploiting from an intelligence perspective during the Second World War. In Japan, they're fighting a war of liberation. They have a phrase called Asia for the Asians, and their objective is to create this East Asian co-prosperity sphere. So the problem with wars of liberation is if you think that you're liberating somebody, you might be conquering them without knowing it, which is part of the issue with Japanese strategy in the Second World War. The tactics that they use, of course, are pretty harsh, and that creates even more problems for them from a media perspective. Of course, the United States is completely unprepared for the attack at Pearl Harbor. More importantly, they're not prepared for the attack against the Philippines either. The senior officer in the Philippines is Thomas Hart, who I'll talk about in a minute, but the senior Army commander is actually this guy. Do we know who that is? Jonathan Wainwright. He's actually the active duty senior commander in the Philippines. So what's this guy? Doug MacArthur, right? What's his role? Anybody? Bueller?
Field Marshal.
He's Field Marshal in the Philippine National Army, retired on active duty. So poor old Wainwright has to deal with MacArthur. So does Tommy Hart, the American commander. If you ever seen the movie They Were Expendable, Tommy Hart is depicted by a very good actor who says, you know, look, our job out here is to lay the bunt down and buy time for our Navy to recover from this disaster at Pearl Harbor. I highly recommend that movie. It's very good. It's also about PT boats. But Doug MacArthur has a very interesting role in the early phases of the Second World War, and he has a very interesting role throughout the Second World War, which is more than I can talk about this evening, but you know, if somebody has a question, I can wax poetic for hours. The early phases of the Second World War in the Pacific are not good. The battles of Java Sea, the Marshall Islands raids, these are all forgotten battles when we think about Midway and all the other big battles. But the smaller battles that are sort of overshadowed by the bigger battles are the ones that you can really glean some interesting lessons. This is the Pope getting shelled by Japanese forces. The old Houston was also sunk. This is Tommy Hart, by the way, who's the senior American commander. The Houston is sort of famous for people who have seen the movie Bridge on the River Kwai. The American character in that movie is supposed to be a survivor from the Houston from these early battles. So the picture I'm painting here is that there's a lot of turmoil going on in the early phases of 1942-43. You got Doug MacArthur down in Australia basically saying, hey, look, Chester Nimitz, this is how you fight the war. Chester Nimitz has the most difficult job of them all because his job is the Pacific. But most people don't realize he had this very task-oriented boss named Ernest King back in Washington who wanted to fire Nimitz at least 3 times during the Second World War because he accused Nimitz of dragging feet. So in that respect, we who have served in the Navy all can have sympathy for poor old Chester Nimitz, who's got all these people telling him to do stuff. And in that respect, I do think that Nimitz is a leader worthy of study because of his ability to balance all of the different political and personality factors that he faced during the war. So I hope I'm not boring you too much. The big point of the Second World War is that it's a global war. And in many respects, the Kennedy family is no bigger or no less than any other family in the United States. And they're sort of caught up in all of this. It is an unprecedented war from an American point of view. It's our first global conflict in which we are now being asked to carry the ball almost completely, because Britain has lost its empire, essentially. Singapore fell, coincident with the Philippines. The Indian Empire, the jewel in the crown. You had Mahatma Gandhi and Chandra Bose fighting to have a free India. In Iraq, there was an Iraqi revolt happening against the British, and all of those resources that were required to maintain access to the empire were being expended. And of course, from an American perspective, we faced a global conflict too. We only had 300 warships on the books in 1941. So it's that early phase of the Second World War where the professionals had to buy that time with the battles such as Java Sea, Midway, and etc., so that we could get the draftees into the ranks, build the ships that they could fight. And it's really after 1943 that we start to get our offensive footing with the ships that we needed to fight the war. And I would argue that it's the role of the practitioner in the active service in peacetime to be prepared to buy that time that the nation needs to be able to fight a war like this. And it's kind of a lost art, but everybody in this room should be prepared to receive their draft notice, just so you know. That's the scope of this war. By the end of the Second World War, the U.S. Navy had swelled to above 2 million personnel and almost 7,000 ships, most of which were commanded by reserve personnel. I've already waxed poetic about the scope, but this gives you an approximate idea of the extent of the Japanese Empire and, of course, the German and Italian situation with the lines of communication. I really like these maps because they show the sort of main lines of communication. Where's that one go? Oh, that's going up there. So when we're talking about the allocation of ships and all of that, the British are trying to defend what they still have with American ships personnel. And of course, we have the same problems in terms of limited capabilities. So when you read the Joint Chiefs and Combined Chiefs minutes, it's all about resource management. We think of the Second World War that we had unlimited resources. Actually, we didn't have unlimited resources. You had to build the resources that you needed, which took time, and then the resources you had to figure out how to use them most effectively. And that's really the story of the Second World War. So, caught up in all of that grand strategic mayhem that I've just outlined is our friend Jack Kennedy, who you see here at right down the road at Melville, Rhode Island. He's receiving his PT boat training because when he got to Chicago, he was able to call his dad up, and his dad was able to pull the strings to get him orders to Melville. It's real close to home, and of course John Kennedy was a good sailor anyway, and he became a PT boat captain, as we all know so well. This is some imagery of Melville, Rhode Island, just down the road. Kennedy is in the mix here in the October of 1942 training class. So, Inga Arvid is a journalist assigned in Washington, D.C. And she used to come up to Melville and meet with John Kennedy and hang around with the Kennedy family because she was considered to be a Kennedy family friend through Kit Kennedy and Joe Kennedy, and they all knew her quite well. None of them thought she was a Nazi spy, and to be honest, I've looked at the secondary sources. They're kind of hazy on the question. I have not looked into the primary sources, the original documentary sources at the FBI or CIA. There is a special collection at CIA. And I've not been able to see any kind of evidence that proves the fact or non-fact of her connections with German intelligence. Indeed, she ended up remaining in the United States and became an American citizen after the war. But at this point, when Kennedy's here in Rhode Island getting his PT boat training, she's coming up to visit with him and the family. This is an interesting guy. I'm going to jump back in time now. This is Hugo Kula. Hugo Kula is an American naval officer, class of 1909 Naval Academy guy, who is from a very wealthy family in the Midwest. His family ran a brewery in Davenport, Iowa. I'm from Iowa, by the way. We like to drink beer. And the brewery was pretty lucrative. And so he went to the Naval Academy and was a very successful naval officer assigned to intelligence. And he was in Russia during the Russian Revolution. Hugo Kula ended up sort of floating the rumor that he was the heir of European monarchs who had been displaced by the revolution. And so everybody in the Navy thought he was some sort of royalty. And he sort of carried this myth on. He's actually just from Iowa, just like me, and just from a brewery family. But he floated this idea that he was royalty. I love the mustache, by the way. So he gets assigned to the Naval War College in 1927 as the aide to Admiral William Pratt, who became the CNO during the 1920s and 30s. He was the chief of the intelligence department at the Naval War College, and he ended up marrying Matilda Bigelow, who her divorce name is Pell. And Claiborne Pell was her son, born in 1918. She divorced Claiborne Pell's father, Herbert, in 1927, and that same year gave birth to Hugo Kula, the son of Hugo Kula. And so the stepson became Claiborne Pell. Pell, of course, became very good pals with the Kennedy brothers, and Pell also dated Kick Kennedy during the 1920s and 30s. Kennedy referred to that time period as his, quote, salad days. There's Claiborne Pell as a child with Hugo Kula. This is a quote. I don't know if you can read it. Bottom line, he said, "Hey, I really enjoyed my time with Hugo Kula. He always had stories to tell. He was a very interesting person who saw a lot of the world. I like to look at guys like Hugo Kula because he's from Iowa, or he's actually from St. Louis, but he lived in Iowa like I did. And, he went into the Navy and saw the world, and he could tell tales like I'm telling you right now. An interesting guy, sort of a footnote. And what's interesting about him is he's right here in Rhode Island also. He's buried right around the corner in Middletown at Berkeley Cemetery. So you can go to his grave, which is exactly what John Kennedy did in 1942 when he was up here, because his friend George Hoke Meade Jr. was killed at Guadalcanal. And Inga Arvid and another friend went to visit the grave of Kennedy's childhood friend Meade. And Kennedy made a statement that is in numerous books. These things can't be faked. There's no bluffing. So Kennedy is looking at death in a different way in the context of the Second World War. He's training to be a PT boat captain. And it's interesting because the Kula family is also connected with Inga Arvid as well. The biography of Inga Arvid actually lays this out quite well. So Kennedy goes off to the Pacific, and we've all seen the movie, right? Or should we get into the tactical aspects of it? He's a PT boat captain. He demonstrates very good seamanship, great leadership qualities. He's popular. He's articulate, and he is assigned to support planning in the PT boat squadron. And he does a pretty good job under some pretty challenging circumstances. So nothing can be taken away from John F. Kennedy as a naval officer. And of course, PT 109 sort of sails into history because of the collision that takes place while he's guarding a passage. And they're trying to maintain silence by keeping one engine sort of turning, but the other engine was turned off and so muffled. If anybody's been at sea in the dead of night, sometimes it can be pretty challenging to see what's coming at you. And it was so dark on the night that they were in the straits that they did not see the approaching Japanese ship. And of course, this is a painting that was presented to President Kennedy later on of the incident, and this is the famous coconut that he kept on his desk as President of the United States, which is actually on display just up the road in Boston. Meanwhile, Joe Kennedy Jr. Is serving over in England, and when Kennedy comes home and is made to be a hero, Joe Kennedy is also recognizing that his war is sort of phased into a mundane sort of routine where he's just flying out over the Atlantic to provide distant air coverage for the convoys that are coming into England. And somebody came up, probably some British guy, came up with a wacky idea to stuff an airplane full of explosives and sail that, or fly that airplane right into a U-boat pen so you could blow up the U-boat pen. Well, it probably wouldn't have worked, but they ended up trying to do it, and they rigged an aircraft with explosives from stem to stern, but then they had an experimental radio control device, and the problem was you couldn't take the aircraft off the ground without a pilot. So the plan was really simple. You put a pilot in the aircraft, you get it off the ground, you arm the weapons, and you turn on the radio control device. Well, Joe Kennedy volunteered for that mission in 1944 to blow up a U-boat pen with a bomber that was laden with all these explosives. And everything was going perfectly. When they got out over the channel, Joe Kennedy said, yeah, we're stable, ready to go. And he flipped all the switches, and the plane just exploded. And that was the end of Joe Kennedy. So sort of a tragic story, a story of the Second World War, very famous family. And we all know John F. Kennedy, but we rarely remember Joe Kennedy, unfortunately. Okay, so the war was the war. It was a huge conflict. Literally everybody in the nation was involved. And John Kennedy comes home from that war a hero. And his father, Joe Kennedy Sr., recognizes that John Kennedy's service in the Second World War, notwithstanding the rumors about Inga Arvid, was sufficient for John Kennedy to run for office. And he's actually featured as a young and up-and-coming politician with lots of bright future ahead of him. This magazine is actually a 1946 magazine. You can see why occupy Europe is the question. And John Kennedy sort of smiling at you. Kennedy's run for president, of course, is wrapped around the heroic story of PT 109. Not to take away from that heroic story, John Kennedy demonstrated outstanding leadership and was recognized for it by the Navy with the Navy Marine Corps Medal, which is a pretty high decoration for heroism. And of course, the movie depiction that we're all hopefully familiar with. It's actually a pretty good movie. More recently, 2000 timeframe, Ballard, who's also a local figure around here, went out and actually found the wreck site of PT 109. I think these are pretty approximate, but this is out of National Geographic. This appears to be a torpedo tube from the wreck of PT 109, and the Navy has confirmed it. So they think that the rest of the boat, the engines and all of that, are below the sand. And it's so deep that it's really unrecoverable. But this is kind of the memory of the Second World War through the eyes of the Kennedy family. And I think Inga Arvid is one of those sort of tales that rarely gets told within a context. And the context that I've tried to provide today is to demonstrate that John Kennedy was an interesting figure who did a lot of interesting things, ended up on the fringes of the early development of the Anglo-American special relationship, which we now have today. After the Second World War, an agreement was signed between Britain and the United States called the UK-US Agreement. And that agreement is the special relationship codified in intelligence form. And of course, during his presidency, John Kennedy sort of nurtured that relationship before, of course, he was unable to continue to serve. I would argue that the memory of Kennedy does continue to sort of last among those of us in the Navy who on Saturday will be screaming, "Beat Army."